Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special edition of Book Passages Conversations with Authors. I'm your host, Paula Farmer, and behind the scenes, making this happen smoothly, our tech supervisor, Nick, is with us. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, everybody in the audience, whether you're live or you're watching this later. Thank you for supporting events like this and supporting your local independent bookstore. We really appreciate that. Always check our website for the latest to see if the event is online like tonight or if it's in the store, because we are doing some of both and sometimes we're doing a combination. As mentioned, this is a and I do want to mention also, we do love for you to kind of make your comments, put in questions. I promise our authors will get to it before they wrap up their discussion. And also like and subscribe to the Book Passage YouTube channel. It's on that link below. That helps us out a lot. As mentioned, this is a very special edition because I have put together kind of a mini series of sorts for the three kind of consecutive live online events throughout the week in honor of Women's History Month. And we are saying that it is women writing, our stories, our voices, our impact in literature and beyond. And tonight the focus is on nonfiction and memoir. With that, we have two featured books and authors. The first, The Love You Saved, by acclaimed journalist and human rights activist, Goldie Taylor. She shares the harrowing yet deeply hopeful story of her troubled childhood in East St. Louis, a memoir of family, faith, and the power of books. How appropriate for a book passage event. We love it. Goldie Taylor's debut memoir, which this is, shines a light on the issues of race, class, gender, and a post-Jim Crow America, while offering a nuanced, empathetic portrait of family in a pitched battle for its very soul. Goldie is a journalist, political analyst, and human rights activist. She has been featured on NBC News, MSNBC, ABC, CNN, HLN, and The Steve Harvey Show, as well as Good Morning America and NPR's All Things Considered. She has written for Salon and the Atlanta Journal and many more publications. I believe she's joining us from the East Coast in Boston, but we'll find out for sure. Our other featured book and Goldie's In Conversation partner is The Dead Are Gods, from an exciting new literary voice, Eirinie Carson. This book is a memoir that explores grief, Blackness, and recovery after death of a dear friend. After an unexpected phone call on an early morning in 2018, Eirinie learned of her best friend Larissa's death. In the wake of her shock, she attempts to make sense of the events leading up to the death and uncover startling secrets about life in process. This is both dealing with grief, but also very much life affirming. And I think it's a book for everyone because on some level we can all relate. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our two talented authors that we are so honored to have tonight. Thank you both.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for having us and, to celebrate Women's History Month. And it is so good to meet you, Eirinie.
It's so lovely to meet you too. I read your book like breathlessly in 3 days, and I feel I'm a little starstruck currently.
Well, don't be starstruck. just Goldie in Boston. I read your book on a couple of plane flights. I was actually going out on book tour when it landed on my doorstep. And so I grabbed it up and it went with me from Boston to Atlanta to DC to New York into St. Louis. And by the time I was back home, I had finished. And talk about breathless, more like speechless for me. Sure.
Oh, thank you so much. That means the world. That feels so good. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think that the things that join us more than anything about our books is the notion of grief. we never know what grief is, as Joan Didion says, until the moment we arrive at it. We never know what it feels like, how high or low it will take us, where it will catch us. Talk to us about what it was like that morning when you got the call for you. Tell the audience about that a bit.
It was really early in the morning, and my baby wasn't sleeping, and my husband had taken her out of the room so I could sleep, and that was when our friend Natalia called and let me know. And she didn't even finish the sentence before I just couldn't let her finish the sentence. I just knew what she was going to say, and rather than hear that, I just started crying and kind of drowned her out that way, and had to get off the phone. And it was a really rough day. We had thought she was missing for about a week before finding this out, and so I think when I got that call, it felt very. I almost knew. I just knew that I've never not heard from her for a week like that. So
I
yeah.
think that's what it's like when we're bound to someone so tightly that we can almost feel they're leaving. When they depart a room, when they depart a building, when they depart this life, that we can almost feel they're leaving. Talk to us about the joys that you had with her. I think you all lived quite a life, I think, together.
Yeah.
About the joys.
I always talk about Larissa and I as like kind of chapters together as like just some of the most fun I've had. And I think we've all been broke teens and early 20 somethings and know what like I mean there's definitely a rose tinted lens on that, because in reality we weren't making our rent. It was very stressful, and having to work extra jobs to like bridge the gap that modeling wasn't filling. But then again, there was just something, so you just didn't know what was going to happen next, especially with Larissa, who was able to open so many doors with just a look. And so being in her wake was special. I was just like dragged along on this amazing adventure with her.
I know what it's like, for sure. But I think the first thing that took me about your book certainly was the power of your friendship, and certainly her passing and your grief. But the thing that struck me before I even opened was the title itself, The Dead Gods. And I think I know something about that from my own life, and the way that I revered a father that I hardly knew, that he was murdered when I was 5, and that for me, he was always gone. I'm turning 55 this July. And so, it's a thing that I don't know that I've ever truly gotten over, really come to grips with or grappled, with in its entirety. And so for you and for Larissa, would you say that there is this constant presence, with her, that even in her passing, that she is with you and informing your life as you move forward now?
Definitely. I think her voice is in my head every time I feel nervous about doing something. I can listen to a playlist of her favorite songs, because she was such a creature of habit. She would listen to the same song over and over and over again. And so listening to those like will just take me right back and fill me with such a confidence that is really wonderful. And I don't know, I think, yes, the title, The Dead Are Gods, it's almost, I mean, it's like a hagiography. I'm like sainting her. But then again, I feel like within the book, I'm very honest about who she was really, and her flaws, and the things that made her difficult to be a friend with, a friend to. And I think I felt that so much in your book with your father, who is this presence. Like he's dead when the book begins, and he's dead throughout, and yet he is this. You're very honest about who he was, but then again, he almost has this like deity presence.
Yes.
And I wonder, and you feel that now today as a 55-year-old person?
I think I did for decades on end.
Mm.
I romanticized who he was, what our lives would have been had he lived. Maybe we wouldn't have struggled so much, I used to tell myself, or maybe he would have been there to protect me when things went awry, when things went to hell. I thought I knew him to be someone strong and with a temper and physical, and I wanted him to be physical with the people who hurt me. But I think in 2016, I did a backward looking investigation of his murder, of all the pieces that I picked up over the years, the
Wow.
people who talked about him, the initial investigators, my mother. I just started, to write it all down. So I wrote a piece for the Daily Beast called In Search of My Father's Killer. But what I realize now looking at that piece, and I did figure out fairly closely as to who his murderer or murderers were and why. But I think I was searching for more than that. I think I was searching for who he was and how he lived. And as I sat back and looked at that piece, I immediately he became ungodly to me in that moment. He became a man with all of his flaws, his foibles, the anger, the temper, the violence against my mother, my siblings. I learned about the day that he pressed my mother's face through a plate glass window. And that was the last moment she spent with him. That, she went home secretly packed, and the next day she was in the wind with herself and her children. When I began to write about that and stumble upon old newspaper articles that would show where he was on trial for manslaughter the year before I was born, for beating a man to death in a bar, these kinds of things came into focus, and I began to see him in his appropriate context, how he lived, how he loved, and what his attachment was really for us as a family. And so I think I came down from romanticizing him the moment my mother said to me, I always wonder what my life would have been had he been alive. And I finally said, Mother, if Father had lived, you probably wouldn't have.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I mean, the end of your book, you talk about your mother kind of still holding his image close in such a tight, kind way.
Oh, yeah, she certainly does. I talk about how she talks about the joys and almost never the sorrows. You sort of have to pry them out of her. They're triggered by something, or she'll tell a story that, maybe seems funny now, but when you think about it, say, Mom, that really isn't a funny story. That was horrid that happened to you. And so I took the same tact in writing this book, that I was catching people at the worst of themselves. I was catching them in their worst moments. But these people grew, they evolved, and they were informed by something before they came and presented themselves into my life. I wanted to give them the context I think I would want to have for myself. Not an explanation, not an excuse, but what defined them as people. And so that led me to talking about my mother and my aunt's traumas, and how they lived or had been forced to live before they ever had children. And now that they were old women in their 80s, beyond the years, I say, when introspection is worthwhile, when questioning and prodding really isn't worth the gamble, that they were all the women that they could be in the time that they had, and that I got from them every piece of love, every piece of energy that they had to give. And that proved to be more than enough. And so I wonder now, as you were writing about Larissa in those moments, were you thinking about that context too? The context you gave to yourself, the context you give to her and those that surrounded you? Because I thought my duty was to be fair to the people who populated my book.
I also felt that fairness was really important, and I didn't want the way she died to define her. And I had initially written a draft of this book without any mention of how she had died, and I couldn't advance. I was like, I'm just stuck. I'm at an impasse. I cannot break through, and I don't know why. I spoke about it with our mutual girlfriends, and was just like, I think I have to talk about how she died, and like somehow contextualize it and make it not the sum total of who she was. And so at that instant, I was like, that was when I was like, oh, this is still being fair, and I'm not being sensationalist, and I'm not glorifying anything. But this needs to be told. And like you said, it's not an excuse, it's not anything like that, it's just context. And that felt really important. And I also I loved the context that you gave, and it makes sense because you're a journalist, that you gave so much context of the history of your city and the history of what was done to Black people by their own city officials, you know. And that contextualized so many people's behavior in the book, so many people's behavior that perhaps would just be dismissed as bad or good was contextualized in this really wonderful way, where they are just humans trying their best, you know, trying to get through. There are people in your book that I still don't forgive, but there are definite, I think your Auntie Gerald, for example, you did such a wonderful job of pulling her back from the precipice of like being a villain, you know. And yeah, I really loved reading that, and I could really feel your desire to be fair.
Yeah. My aunt passed away just a couple of years ago, just before she was on her deathbed, as Kamala Harris was stepping onto the stage, knowing that she was going to be vice president. And it struck me that my Aunt Gerald was a precinct captain, poll worker, the kind of person who drove people to the polls and helped them to vote and registered people. And so I wrote about that night what she would have thought seeing Kamala Harris step across that stage. She passed away next day, and she passed away with me knowing in my bones how deeply she loved me, that if there was a favorite, it was me. That for all of the sheer terror that I had as a young girl, she had a rationale to that if I could keep her here in the confines of this house, if I could make her live out her fullest potential in a schoolhouse, then, she will survive all of this. I opened the book in 1980. This is before crack cocaine, and heroin is around and other things, and marijuana is, it's proliferated the streets. It was everywhere, of course, in an illicit way. So kids were still smoking in the basement and in the back alley, that kind of thing. But in the middle of the book, right around 82, 83, crack cocaine hit St. Louis. And it is like a fire tearing through a straw hut in a high wind. And it is touching every house around ours. And my aunt and uncle, they're watching this happen. And then it touches our house, and older cousins, older brother, they get caught up in this stuff. And my aunt grabbed onto me and other girls in the house and drew us in even tighter then, that she was afraid that whatever was lurking out in the street would take us from her. And so she was even more harsh. By then, the chores got harder, the discipline got harder, that it was almost tough to breathe. But for her, there was a decision of, do I hold them so closely in here, or do I let the streets take them? And she'd made her choice and made it very clear to all of us, so that, my life went on, and I grew and I flourished, and she saw me on TV doing the news and, arguing with various pundits and anchors across the landscape. And she was hugely, insanely proud of that. But I will tell you this, she never once took credit for any of it. She never said, because I did this, this, and this, you became that. She never said that because I kept you out of the street, because I kept, someone from taking you in that way. She never said you made it because I kept you safe. But that was the truth of it. And so I wanted that Geraldine to show up on the pages for sure.
I think she did. I also think, yes, she kept you safe, but there's also just little Goldie is so amazing. And I mean, grown Goldie is also, but to watch you kind of, there's something inside of you that is like driving you in this like forward momentum way, despite every external factor's attempt to kind of halt you.
Sure.
And that is like such a testament to who you are and the person that you have become. And I also wonder, I know you have a daughter and you have a granddaughter. Do you find yourself ever did you find yourself raising your daughter ever feeling that desire to kind of keep her close?
Oh, yes. No question. I certainly was the terror that my aunt had been, or my cousin Bug. My cousin Bug is now a grown woman, and we are very close, by the way.
Oh, I'm so glad. I was going to ask her that.
So the Bug in the book who tormented me is now one of my closest cousins, and we're like sisters now, that were grown women. But it was I never thought myself to be special. I thought myself to be one of many, many, many children around me who had, someplace else to be. And that this wasn't going to be my final stop. That I had committed to myself that what was happening to some of my school friends, what was happening to some of our neighbors, the kids over in the Gumpers, I talk about the Gumpers housing project not far from our house, that kids had been shot my age and were no longer here, that my friend Sean Clark was found dumped in a Dipsy dumpster upside down, shot to death in 1986. But when I think about what kept me moving, it was I just didn't want my story to end. Whatever that story would be, whether I'd be a nurse, or a lawyer or a newscaster, or any of the other things I wanted to be in my head, that this couldn't be it, that this couldn't be all that there was. And so the thing that drove me then is what drove me through my adulthood, is that this cannot be all that there is. As for my own girls, and I have a middle son, I kept them close as well. And so my son didn't have video games until he was 14 years old. He's 31 now. There were things, I was an overly restrictive parent, I think, in some ways, and permissive in some others, right? But in the ways that I was restrictive, it was how my children could dress, what they could have, in terms of, balance, or food. I wanted things to be orderly. I wanted a peaceful, orderly house because I didn't have that. Aunt Cheryl's house was chaos for sure, because there were so many people coming in and out. I demanded a peaceful house, and we had that. It hid some other stuff, though. There was less talking and emotional things going on, that there was not a psychological safety, I find, for my children to come to me and tell me anything, right? But we live and learn with that. They are now all in their 30s, living out their own lives, seeing the world on their own terms. And what I can tell you is I wish I had let that island be a little bit bigger, that I wish that I had allowed them a bit more freedom in a lot of ways, for sure. But I think as surely as I'm my mother's child, I'm also my Aunt Geraldine's child. And so there were clear strictures, as they were being raised. I now have a now turning 10-year-old granddaughter who I'm raising. She is my baby's baby. And I find myself investing in her things that we weren't able to have. And so little Goldie couldn't play the piano, so Taylor now has, piano lessons. There are things that she has that I can do for her. But the thing that she has that I didn't have as a child and my own children didn't have, is an adult in the house who tells them they love them every single day.
Mm.
And so there is, and we show that and we do that, and it's an action for us. And
Yes.
so
Yes.
I'm getting to do this again. And I think there's something to that.
That's really beautiful. I mean, I don't know if we're allowed to cuss on this. There's a poem.
Women's History Month, we can say it.
It's Women's History Month. Who's gonna stop me? Not a man. There's that poem. They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They don't mean to, but they
Don't
do.
need to.
And I
They do.
and I think about that. I'm also
Yeah.
raising two small girls, and you know, the energy that I put into trying to be conscious of how I am parenting them.
Yeah.
I mean, one day they're gonna have something to say about the way I did it.
They always will. They hope they always will. My daughter had the glory of writing her own memoir that came out 2 weeks before mine. So
Oh my God,
she had her say.
that's my follow-up.
She had her
How
say for
was
sure.
that, reading that? Did she let you read a manuscript beforehand, or were you just, here's the finished thing?
She did. She was telling me snatches, and Mom, I don't know if you want me to tell this part or tell that part. And I said to her, I will say to you what my mother said to me as I wrote mine. You have to tell the story that only you can tell. This isn't my story. I may be in it, but it is yours. And so if you put it in pages, please do. She did. And I read the manuscript. It was in a Google Doc. I pulled it up. It was on my phone. I never put the phone down.
Oh.
I read it throughout the day and into the evening until it was finished. And it was so candid, so frank, but so beautiful. And I got to see how my 13-year-old Katie saw me. And I said, gosh, Aunt Geraldine would have read my book and saw 13-year-old Goldie talking to her about this life. So in some ways, it was heartbreaking. In some ways, in others, I said, wow, what a strong child you've raised. And so there were, but I think there's something wrong with the word resilience.
Oh, interesting. How come? What?
Because like my daughter and like my mother, you know, we never wanted to be or don't want to be something extraordinary. If extraordinary has to come with that much pain, I'd rather just be what I call regular schmegular. And so I think that is the thing that I wanted most people to take away from both books, from hers and from mine, is that, you know, resilience for me is a bad word because it means you have to go through some things to prove it. And those things sometimes aren't worth the cost of admission. I am, by grace of angels, as one of the person has said now in the chat, I am, but by the grace of angels, still alive. And if I could give back a whole lot of what went on in my book, I would. I'd trade it, not to have the voice that I have now.
Oh, yes.
I'd trade it. I would trade it.
Yeah. Yes, of course, of course. I mean, that's the kind of interesting thing that I found. And my book isn't out yet, and it's out in 3 weeks on the 11th of April. But I'm kind of like navigating this world now where people have read maybe an advanced copy, or my friends have an advanced copy, and it's an interesting place to write something that is painful, memories that are painful, or write something hard from your heart, and have, how do you hold the success of something whilst also holding the pain of what created the thing, the art, you know? I don't know how to do that, and I wondered how you have processed your success and your accolades.
That part is still tricky for me, you know, and this has got to be you, that we're writing about the trauma of such great pain, and then it's for sale.
Yeah.
And then you have to go out and promote it and tell people you want to buy this book because, no, I don't think it's any great literary feat, but there's a lot of pain in those pages. And I almost feel like it's a trafficking of sorts. And it's a hard balance to strike for going on a book promotion tour. I'm not, I haven't written the next great James Patterson novel, right? I haven't written Moby Dick or something. I've written a memoir about the pain of my own life. To take that on tour continues to be tough for me. And so for all of the cities that, I've been in so far, to talk about it has been tough. It has been easier talking about the social issues that I raise: poverty, domestic violence, gun violence, illicit drug use, teenage pregnancy, all of the things that populate the book as issues. It's been easier for me to talk about those things than it has been to talk about, the daggers, the slings and arrows that I or others took in the book. But the cool thing, and I'll have to ask you about this, about how your friends and family took the reading, that when I got to St. Louis, I hadn't really said to family, hey, come out and see all the trauma I've written about us, right? I didn't, bang the drum, but I put it on Facebook and Instagram where they follow. And my 8th and 9th grade honors English teacher, she's in the book, Peggy Lewis LeCompte, she came out onto stage with me. And as we walk out, the lights are shining. You can't really see the audience, but you can see the first couple rows. And before I'm seated, I turn to my left and there is Cousin Bug in the front row. And Marcio, her son, who's also in the book, he is seated next to her, and Marcio's wife and others. And Kenneth in the back of the book is in the back. I can begin to see the people who populate the book, who populated my life. Well, they're in the auditorium now. They're there in the synagogue now. And so it was almost a sigh of relief.
Yeah.
That I had done them fairly and treated myself with some fairness, but that I had been honest about who we all were in that moment. And so it was a bit of a nervousness, but a bit of relief to see them there. When your advanced reader copies came out, I'm sure that family, friends read. And, what did you think as you were handing them a copy?
Some people read it. I was really selective. Some people read it. My mum has not read it yet. Yeah. But we have talked extensively about the context of the book and the way she's represented in it. So I don't think anything's shocking there. I definitely, one thing I found that I don't know if you found, writing stuff that's hard and that's so personal, and people who know you can read it and go, oh my God, Goldie, I'm so sorry. Yeah. For me, I found that really frustrating. I was like, no, that wasn't, that's not the point for you to feel bad for me or sad or sorry you didn't hug me longer when you found out that Larissa died. It's that you see this life and that you see the importance of grieving aloud and what that means. I'm a small facet of this story, I feel. I wonder if you also found those responses.
I did. I found those responses. My mother, I actually refused to send my mother an ARC. She still lives with a cast of maladies, anxieties, and a sort of a working depression that covers her daily life. And I said, Mom, I'm not sure this is a book you want to read. That for where you are sitting today, that I just want you to know that you did the impossible and you brought these children to growth, and that my sister and I, Lorianne, that we survive, cope, and we make it. And you can say, job well done, and know that you sacrificed every single thing. She did get it on her own. She ordered her own copy as soon as the books were dropped.
She was like, sure, Goldie.
Sure, okay. I'm gonna read this book. Now, I've written 3 novels before. She's got them all like trophies on a shelf. She's never read them. And I said, oh, she'll never read it. Until one Saturday morning, she called and FaceTime, and she was in tears. She says, I am on page 28.
Oh my God, no.
And
oh no.
My heart sank because she just kept saying how sorry she was. I should have known. I'm so sorry. And as she read more, there were more calls exactly like that one. And I realized the reason I hadn't allowed her to read the book is because we would have to do the hard work of putting her back together again. Because the book for her was a reliving of my father's murder, reliving of traumas to me, things she didn't know about her sister. You know, she was so angry with Aunt Gerald that she went to go dig her up, she said. She was very angry, very, very angry with Aunt Geraldine. And so that was, of all of the other people who have read, that was the most difficult one. Because, you know, she had to sort of reconcile with herself that she was, as we all say, a good enough mom, right? That whatever thing she could go dig up to give us, she would do exactly that. And she was sending me to a place where she thought I'd be safe. And to turn out that that wasn't the case, it was devastating to her.
Yeah.
So sure, it really was. There's a question. I'm seeing questions pop up here that says, the first one says, and I think this one is for you, that says, I love the title. Why didn't you go with gods as opposed to angels?
I never thought of angels. I don't know. I think angels sounds so perfect. And gods, I think, when I think of gods plural, I think of like ancient Greece and those like flawed, fallible deities. And that's what I wanted. I didn't want her to be this pristine creature with wings. I wanted her to be someone who ruled my heart, but was also a person who made mistakes, and a person who could be mean, and a person, you know, with all the trappings of being human.
With all the trappings of being human. Oh, sure. I think that and I have my novel was Paper Gods, by the way. So I've used gods, you know, in the title for exactly that reason, right? The fallible, you know, human gods that we all are in some way.
Yeah. And then there's one for you.
Yeah, the next question is, will you be in East St. Louis or St. Louis to speak again? Likely so. We did an event on February 1 where I was in town, but now I have all of my father's siblings. He has step siblings in St. Louis who have said, you've got to come home again to meet all of us. I've only met a few of them to meet all of us, but two, there's an ask for me to come back again and just, you know, pick up the people who we didn't get to see the first two events around. So I imagine that I'll be back in St. Louis again. It'll likely be sometime in May, is my guess. We're going to do the LA Festival of Books next month, and then do a second leg of the tour, cover west of the Mississippi, you know, St. Louis and rest of western Mississippi after that. So
I've never been to St. Louis, and I wonder, what does East St. Louis look like now? Do you visit the old neighborhood?
I do.
The gentrification time?
No, gentrification. Gentrification never came to East St. Louis. And the city that you saw breaking down the book has almost completely broken down now. They've had a few new housing starts. You know, it is an entrepreneurial town, you know, still in terms of people, you know, creating work for themselves. But the block that we lived on between 9th and 10th Street, between Summit Avenue and Pennsylvania, let's say there were 40 homes on that block. There might be 4 left. Wow. In that they have been demolished, fallen into such disrepair, and taken away by the bricks. There used to be 3 very strong high schools: Assumption High School, Lincoln Senior High School, and East Side. Now there's one, a consolidated East Side Lincoln High School out on State Street. They've got a big shiny new football stadium that they still win football games. Boy, do they. But the city itself never really had any bootstraps. So poor that in the 80s, there was a man who was beaten in the city jail. This is after my book takes place, and beaten to within an inch of his life. Well, he sued the city. This man did. The city was so broke that it couldn't pay the $4 million verdict. And time went on, they couldn't pay until the judge handed over the keys to the city's city hall because the city was bankrupt. It was, tens of millions of dollars in debt. And later on, he didn't actually take City Hall, but he had ownership of it.
Wow.
He traded that deed in for a stretch of land along the riverbank. So now he owns this riverfront property where all the boats come in, and they pay him because he owns the land where the boats come in.
Good for him.
That will tell you something about a city that never was really able to get up off of its knees. But you will find that East St. Louisans are a proud bunch. You will never hear someone from East St. Louis say, I'm from St. Louis. It is a different place. It is a different state. It's across the water, separated by the Mississippi. And we are proud and faithful people. And we don't talk bad about our city, we say. I have broken ranks here with this book. I have to tell you that, there are staunch defenders of our hometown that we don't say bad things about East St. Louis, but it is a bottomed out town. And there is very little left of the city that I adored. But even knowing that when I was coming along in the 80s, that it was still a shell of the city that it had been before that.
Right.
Yeah. And no gentrification, but you do have investors from out of town who are buying large swaths of land. And they've been doing it for the last 2 decades, paying the back taxes, grabbing up the land. It's 2 or 3 companies at tops that are doing it. No one knows what they'll ever do with that land.
Nothing good.
Nothing good. Nothing good for the people who currently.
Nothing good for the people who live there, yes, or from there. Are your family still in East St. Louis?
We still own the house. Bug's oldest daughter lives there with her children and grandchildren. And we still have cousins littered throughout the city from 9th Street clear out to around 50th and State. And so lots of family still there. Lots of friends who are still there. Happened to be on Facebook this evening. And, we used to sell hot plates off the back porch, fried fish, barbecue. Well, someone was holding a barbecue in Cahokia. And they said, come on by. We still have ribs left. And so, the culture is still, as it were, in East St. Louis. We're still selling hot plates.
Yeah. I love that so much.
So someone would like to know if you're going to be in England promoting your book as well as in the US.
That's a great question. I'm working very hard to be in the UK. That feels pretty important to me. I'm hoping that it will come to fruition. We're planning something currently. So tentatively, yes.
Yeah.
We will see.
Book tours, and for the folks in the book who are looking for speaking, book tours are so hard, folks, because, every writer, including me, we sometimes show up and there are 200 people in the room. The other times we show up and there are 5. And so you can promote the event and across every social media, and your book publisher will get involved, and all the publicists, and people will have their way with your events. And so I was at home in Atlanta. I lived in Atlanta a good long time. I was in Atlanta and we had a packed house, but then we were in DC and we had maybe 30 people. We were in a back room of the bookstore. It was a great time in DC, but a smaller group of folks. So our publishers are sometimes hesitant to push too many book events, knowing how much effort you put into them and not sure, if it will always pay off. And so they're a little careful. I'll tell the audience, they're a little careful about how many of us they put out on tour.
Yes, that is very true.
There are so many books out today. When I started working on my first manuscript, it was 1997. It was really hard to find an agent, let alone a publisher then. And vanity presses were still a thing. Self-publishing was barely taking root. And but today, there are many more publishing houses, many more agents, many more distribution models, many more publishing models than there ever was. I think when my book came out in January, I was just floored by how many book birthdays there were going to be. I was thinking my book was a big deal, but yeah, so are like 50 others.
Right. It is quite humbling, that experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about your father, because I feel my father also appears in my book in kind of a similar way,
Yes.
where his presence is there. Um, and I wonder, I don't know if I have a question. I wrote a bunch of things down, but I hold on. I can think of
Yeah.
something smart, I'm sure of it. Um, how did you balance the kind of badness of him with this tender eye, and his siblings, when they read your book, did they feel that was like an honest representation? Have they read the book?
Oh, well, just like Bug, my father was who he was. And, none of these things were private that I wrote about. In fact, as I said, some of them were in the newspaper, right? And so my father's temper was very, very well known. And
Mm,
his relationship with my mother, tumultuous, very well known. And so there were no surprises, I think, where my father was concerned in the book. For me,
mm,
I'm still his little girl, right? And so I wrote about the tenderness with which I looked at him then, um, you know, idolizing a man who was no longer there.
mm,
Um, but I think I also touch down where there were times when I wondered why I needed a father like that. How could he say that he loved his wife and his family and treat them the way that he did? Um, and so I came down on the side of, you're going to be honest with your emotions about him throughout. As it ebbs and flows and waxes and wanes, you're going to be honest about him. And what I think I say in the epilogue about my mother's love for him, you see me talking about several couples in the book. And I name check them all in the back. And
mhm,
I talk about the love they shared and how it was shown, right? That Aunt Gerald and Uncle Ross, and how they showed their love for one another, Auntie Killer and Uncle Bird, how they showed their love for one another. But you'll note that I talk about my mother's in a one-sided way.
mm,
I don't mention, or say, how my father showed my mother love,
mm,
because I didn't see any. I hadn't experienced or witnessed any. And even today, in the stories that she tells, I don't see it come. Yeah, I'm certain that my father was a narcissist.
mm,
I'm certainly he was a malignant narcissist. I'm certain of it. Um, Looking back on his life and hearing what I hear about him today, I could not describe for the life of me a way in which my father had shown my mother love,
mm.
other than her mourning for him.
I like it.
Yeah.
I do. I feel like your description of figuring out him kind of dropping from this godly level
Mm-hmm.
into that, you said 2016 is when you kind of wrote that article and then kind of had that feeling. And it's so similar to what kind of everyone has with their parents at some point,
Yeah.
where you realize they aren't all
Yeah.
knowing, you
Yes.
know?
Yeah.
And it's interesting to have that kind of later in life.
I think it really is. And, even though my mother and I went through the things we went through as a young girl, I still saw her as a god, that
Mm,
she was the figure that I wanted to emulate. She used to wear these double long eyelashes. Before wearing lashes was a cool thing. She was a Diana Ross wearing lashes woman with the big, big long legs and all that. She looked like a showgirl when she left the house. And as a young woman, I wanted to look just like her, right? So I did my face in this. We actually look alike. So I did my face in the same way. I tried on her shoes and all of those things. And I revered her. I thought she was the smartest person I'd ever met. But then age came. I got older and she got older.
mm,
And the roles reversed, where my sister and I had become the caretakers, and she had become fragile and not able to have the voice that she used to have, or have the command for a room that she used to have. My mother used to walk in a room and turn every head of the room. And it wasn't, it was how she carried herself. And that woman was gone. And I remember being angry about that. I remember being angry that my mother couldn't be the woman that I had, revered so much, that my reverence for her now was different. My reverence was now for all that she had come through, and for the deep and abiding faith that she had, in the way that she's matured and evolved, and how compassionate she's become in her older age. And it's a remarkable thing. So I look up to her in different ways now. I remember mourning, almost resenting that age had taken away this thing that I idolized.
Yeah, but what you've been left with, that's something that's interesting to kind of see that stripped away and see who's beneath.
I had never seen my mother scared before until, she was in her late 70s now, and now 80, that I had never seen her afraid. I say in the book that she was the kind of woman who did her crying in the dark. But I can now see the tears that I couldn't see then. And that was really hard. I think Paula said she's coming back with questions.
It's so hard to come in because it means it's almost over. This has been very insightful and comforting in a lot of ways. I think people can empathize and sympathize. I do have a couple questions. One for both of you, because of the subject matter of both your books, very emotionally charged. Positively and negatively in some ways. I'm wondering, was the writing process very challenging emotionally, or was it more cathartic? Was there something just kind of very healing in getting pen to paper and going through the emotions again?
Really?
I think for me, it felt very cathartic. And also, so much of my writing happened when I felt emotionally either overwhelmed or very raw, and very like the feelings came before the words did. And so I was often writing from a place of anger or sadness or fear. And in that way, it was cathartic, as I was able to kind of get that feeling out. It's hard when someone dies, because so often people are scared to ask you about them. They don't want to see you cry. Please God, don't cry. It's kind of like, I'm just dealing with this thing, and we know, and it's sad, and I'm sorry. And I didn't really feel like I had anyone to really go into the depths of it with. And so writing for me was that processing.
Well, it came out as beautiful prose.
Thank you.
Some things are dense and you struggle through, and they're traumatic. Your book was immediately readable. Just draws you into it in one passage, lends right to the next and right to the next. And so and that was it was sad every time a plane would land and I had to put it away.
Oh, nice to hear. Thank you.
For me, it was both at different points. And so as I'm writing, there was this grief. And so I'm writing through this heaviness, and there are tears, even in the fun parts of the book. There are tears and grief on top of grief on top of grief. And so there were times, I wrote this during the pandemic, where I just had to lay myself down before I could get up and do more. And I realized that so much of the story had been written from me in other places, the Daily Beast, where I'm still editor at large, and other places I've written these articles, and piecing things together. Relief came when it was over. And although, there was still, the sorrow for the things that you dug into about yourself, I likened it to taking off a winter coat in the summertime. That I felt a great burden release. And it wasn't that just simply that I told the story. It was that I had set the bones in place that for all of those years, it had been 50 years at that time, I was 51, 50 years at that time. I've been 40 years at that time, been 40 years at that time, I was 11 years old, that I had released 11-year-old me from being culpable. That for those 4 decades, I was still shouldering shame and blame for sexual violence against myself at 11. And so only after I finished was I able to put that blame and shame away and aim it where it belonged.
Wow, I can't imagine the relief you must just years, decades.
Yeah.
Holding that in. That's amazing. The power of writing and making yourself face your feelings and past to kind of clear a path for the future and the present. Switching gears just a little bit, I'm curious for both of you, is there any other writer, author, specific books that maybe inspired you while you were writing, or maybe before you did, and helped get you into the process and the journey? And that could be obviously nonfiction or fiction.
Sure.
You go first, Goldie.
No writer takes me over like Joan Didion. And so I read The Year of Magical Thinking, had read it twice. And before I knew I was writing this memoir, we had sold the book proposal. And, you sort of get yourself geared up to dive in. And I took out The Year of Magical Thinking again. And I wanted to be as precise. That Didion was exquisite in the way that she identified the source of things. And I wanted to take readers inside. She was very good at taking people along with her where she was. You were in the apartment with her. You were at the hospital. You were on the road with your hair flying through the window of the convertible. She took you with her. And so I read Didion again. One, because of the way in which she inspires, but the lessons she teaches about grief without ever saying so were almost like having a therapist, at my bedside of, this is going to be okay.
And you, Eirinie?
I also read Year of Magical Thinking. I loved it. One of my very good friends did not enjoy it, but I adored it, and I also think she had such a beautiful way, the delve into like the magicalness of grief, and how you can just, she couldn't get rid of his shoes, but she got rid of all of his clothes because she knew that if he came back, then he'd need his shoes, but the logic didn't apply to the clothes, and just that kind of skewed lens on the world, and it makes sense when you're doing it, and looking back, it's only when you're like, so there was that. There was also Jane, a Murder, which is by Maggie Nelson, that is about her aunt who was murdered before Maggie Nelson was even born. But it's kind of an unconventional story of someone who died, and there's a lot of the aunt's personal diaries within the book, and that was when I kind of felt I had permission. I read that book and I felt I had permission to kind of use Larissa and I's emails and texts the way I do in the book. And then also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Nick Cave's Red Hand Files. Nick Cave, the singer-songwriter who lost his son when his son was a teen, writes really beautifully about grief, and does kind of a agony aunt thing with his audience, and he was just really anchoring for me.
That's amazing. Yeah, those are great recommendations. Thank you so much. And thank you both for this just moving conversation. For kind of, I don't know, is this a first event for you, Eirinie? Because your book isn't yet.
Yeah, kind of this is the first event.
It can't be a lot because we don't have the actual book. But yeah.
On 2 layers of deodorant today. I was stressing about this, but this has been so wonderful. And I couldn't have picked a better in conversation person than Miss Taylor. And I truly just adored your book. And I will never use the word resilient again, but I just think that you have consistently been a phenomenal person and presence with such resolve.
Thank you. Well, I cannot wait for your book birthday.
Yay.
We will push it far and wide. And when we know where you are, if you're in a city near, I will come and hug your neck. For
Okay.
sure. It's, and I think that's important. You know, when I launched, you know, in January, I had all of my media sisters with me, right? And so I had all of these very strong, powerful, accomplished women who were pushing me, pushing the book. And I just think it's important that women do that for one another in our creative works, in whatever thing that we are doing, that we help one another along, for sure.
Yes,
Yeah.
I've definitely found that particularly Black writers, women writers in my life have been just so boosting and
Generous. Yeah, they've been generous.
there for me. Yeah, it's been really wonderful. So happy Women's History Month. Is tying in with the theme. I'm tying in with the theme.
Thank you. We're going to wrap it up with the kind of coming back full circle on the theme, and thank you both. And thank you to the audience for participating, whether you were able to join us live or you're watching this later in our archives. We do appreciate the support for events like this and for wonderful, talented, important authors like this. Do support them. Eirinie mentioned her book is coming out Tuesday, April 11th. But you can pre-order that. You can call Book Passage, or when you're in Book Passage, either location, Corte Madera, San Francisco, you can pre-order, and that actually is so helpful to authors. It really gives them kind of a boost with their publishers. But we do have Goldie's book already, and I believe we may even have some book plates as in signed editions. So please definitely come in, call up, go online and order both these magnificent books that are so important and timeless in their messaging. Thank you until our next event, which the next one in this series will be Thursday at 6 o'clock Pacific time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Eirinie.